Postscript Media, podcast for a changing planet.
We hear from so many listeners who want to know how to eat better for their bodies and for the planet. We've talked about meat versus plants, processed food versus whole food, milk versus almond milk, and we did a whole episode on the pros and cons of local food. But we haven't talked about the ultimate local food, the food you grow or raise or hunt or fish yourself. First-hand food.
That sounds familiar, Mike, and I think I like what you're getting at here.
Well, Tamar, it just so happens that a few months ago, I read this smart and hilarious book about first-hand food. The author actually invented the phrase first-hand food. So I thought it would be cool for everyone to hear what she had to say about it. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest today is Tamar Haspel.
Come on, Mike. Do you really think I would stoop to use our pod to promote my book, which is called To Boldly Grow, is wildly funny, contains the secret to successful improvement, and is available wherever books are sold?
Well, it's an amazing book. So, true story, I don't know if our listeners know this, but we had never met, never spoken on the phone. But after I read To Boldly Grow, I cold called you and suggested we should do a podcast together.
You cold DM'd me, yeah.
Well, and then we talked like 10 minutes later. I'm actually a little embarrassed that it's taken us this long to devote an entire episode to your book, which I should mention would make a truly excellent holiday gift for Climavores listeners or their loved ones.
Look, I'm totally good with promotion, but let's not forget that our show is about climate. And the book is about all the good things that happen when you grow or fish or raise or forage your own food. And climate really only plays a big part.
Well, you shouldn't feel bad, Tamar. My first book, The Swamp, which is no longer available wherever books are sold, although you can still find it online. But it was about the Everglades, and to my eternal embarrassment, it barely mentioned climate change, even though the Everglades might end up underwater because of climate change. Now, I actually read your book, and it's true, it's not a climate book, but it does have all kinds of climate stuff, right? Like, I remember the section about how foraging for mushrooms can be hell on your carbon footprint.
It totally can. There is that.
Right? You have a whole chapter on, we talked about this a little bit on Thanksgiving episode, but the most climate-friendly meat, right?
Yeah, that part I think is a surprise. And I think there's some other surprises when it comes down to plants and climate. And my last Washington Post column was about how leafy greens are not the best for the climate. And I have to say, I got a pretty supercilious email on that subject. From a guy who wrote to me suggesting that my reporting needed context because he grows his own vegetables with very few inputs. He feeds his organic waste to his worm farm and is basically holier than thou, or at least holier than me in every way. His vegetables, his leafy greens, are super climate friendly. And I have to say, he had a point. So we definitely have something to talk about here.
I don't understand you, Tamar. I mean, the whole point of having a podcast is to make fun of people who send us obnoxious emails. It's not to acknowledge that they might have a point.
Okay, then. We'll leave him aside and let's just talk about the climate impact of food that you glean from the landscape around you. And if any of you grow your own food or fish it or hunt it or forage it, this show is for you.
Look, I can barely grow my toenails, but I'm interested in the climate impact of first-hand food. And most of all, I want to promote this incredibly awesome and hilarious book. So I'm not worthy, and I'm Michael Grunwald.
And I'm Tamar Haspel, and this is Climavores, a show about promoting a show about eating on a changing planet.
Is it too late to avert the climate crisis? How is our fossil fuel usage impacting everyday life? These questions may seem scary, but former UN climate chief Christiana Figueres believes there's hope. In her podcast, Outrage and Optimism, she and her co-hosts will break down the latest climate news, introduce you to the incredible activists making a difference, and maybe inspire you to play your part in averting climate change. Find Outrage and Optimism wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is sponsored by FX's Kindred, the original series only on Hulu. Based on Octavia E. Butler's best-selling novel, FX's Kindred centers on Dana James, a young Black woman and aspiring writer. Dana begins to settle into her new home in Los Angeles and is violently pulled back and forth in time. She emerges at a 19th century plantation and is confronted with secrets she never knew ran through her blood. FX's Kindred, all episodes now streaming only on Hulu.
So Tamar, I'm going to embarrass you because I really am an evangelist for To Boldly Grow. I think it's just it's really amazing, and partly because it's not just about food. It's a book about doing stuff, which I think is really cool as somebody who's mostly incapable of doing stuff. And it also turns out to be a book about love and marriage, almost a how-to book in many ways about love and marriage. And when you think about it, like, doing stuff and loving, that's kind of what life is. Like, that's pretty much it. So it really is a wise book about how to live. I would love you to tell our listeners a little bit about, how you got the idea and how this project got started.
Well, both the doing and the loving are sort of wrapped up in my husband, Kevin. And, I was never much of a doer. I lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I did a lot of things in my armchair. I was curious about the world, but I've always been sort of a hesitant traveler, and I didn't know how to build anything. And Kevin comes along, and he is a doer, down to his very core. And you marry a doer at your peril because you never know exactly what he's going to want to do. And Kevin wanted to put a vegetable garden, on the roof of our Manhattan apartment building. And I'm like, well, do you think we could get permission for that? If everybody wanted to do it, there wouldn't be any room up there. And he's like, honey, people in this building don't even cook their own food. They're not going to grow their own food. And so we got permission from the building management, and we schlepped a bunch of whiskey barrels up there, and we planted some tomatoes and some berries and some cucumbers. And it was interesting. And I watched them grow, and anybody who's ever grown anything has this sense of wonder that this actually happens. And then when the cherry tomatoes finally bore fruit, and anyone who's ever grown a tomato and stood in the garden and eaten it still has that new tomato smell. And you're ready to swear in a court of law that it's the best tomato that the planet has ever seen. And that was the inception of this project, this idea that, hey, food that you're invested in, food that you grow yourself, has a particular power. It tastes delicious, not necessarily because it is delicious, although there's some of that too, but it's because you're invested. So I got this 1-2 punch of a husband and a doer. And then, when we moved from New York, basically almost by accident, to Cape Cod, I started looking around and saying, okay, well, what can I do here that I couldn't do in Manhattan? And the answer was all kinds of things. And it started with gardening.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that so many of us are passive about our food, right? It's just something that comes to us, some more ready-made than it should, right? But certainly that it's not something that we're involved in producing when Americans all used to produce our food. It's really, I think that's sort of what makes your book so powerful. Again, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as you said, an emotional one. But I want you to talk a little bit more about Kevin, because you're very different types of people, but you have this amazing concept of non-overlapping magisteria, which then, of course, after setting it out as a principle, you then violate repeatedly.
Yeah,
but I want
What's
you
a principle for?
I want you to tell people about it, because it's just, I think anybody who's in a relationship should hear about it.
So Kevin and I are wildly different. And if there's 10 ways to solve a problem and you ask each of us for our top 5, there will be no overlap. And there's a story I used to illustrate this, because this is a matter of temperament, that I am always looking for the low labor makeshift way to solve the problem. And Kevin is always he's gonna solve the problem for all time. And I come by this honestly because my mother was exactly the same way. And when we were kids, this is the best illustration of this mindset that I know. When we were kids, we were kind of the neighborhood weirdos, and we were the target of occasional neighborhood vandalism. And one day the mailbox got loose so you could pick it up. And somebody picked up the mailbox and left it in the backyard. And it annoying. And the way you solve this problem, obviously, and the way Kevin would have solved the problem if he had been there, is to pour a concrete foundation and put in a new mailbox, and then come Armageddon, it'll be the last mailbox standing. My mother's solution to this was to put the mailbox out in the morning and then take it in with the mail. And to her credit, this actually worked pretty well, unless you were late getting out there. And I think there was some kind of rule that the mailman had to put the mail in the mailbox. So you would go running out with the mailbox and hold it out to the mailman, and then he'd put the mail in and bring it in. So anyway, that is where I come from temperamentally. And Kevin and I took our cue about non-overlapping magisteria from an essay by the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould. And he wrote about reconciling science and religion. And the case he made was that we don't have to reconcile them because they deal with completely different areas of knowledge, non-overlapping magisteria. And so Kevin and I decided that every marriage needs non-overlapping magisteria. There are things that he does, hopefully without interference. There are things that I do without interference. But the problem, of course, as you alluded to, is that this requires one party or the other to butt out. And look, butting out is not my long suit. Let's face it.
It is not your magisterium. I can attest to this.
Yes, you can.
But I think one of the things that's really cool about this narrative is, it's about the different things that you get into, and we'll talk about some of them, about gardening, about hunting, about fishing. But it's also a story of you gathering skills, of you learning stuff, figuring out how to do things. And that, I think, is where the book really sort of transcends food. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, sort of when you started to realize that this was sort of just bigger than, what percentage of our food are we making ourselves?
When I started it, that totally was it. It was about food. We're going to see what kinds of food we can raise or forage or hunt, and how much of our food we can provide in that way. And the answer, by the way, on a big year was about 30% of calories. But it started to be about skill acquisition. The secret to successful self-improvement is to try things you've never done before, because that's the steep part of the learning curve. I can work on, being a better writer, which I have for decades. I tried to do better. But, it's hard to get better once you've been doing it for 30 years. But if you've never done it before, it's easy to get better. And so we fish and we tow a boat. And, because Kevin is better at so many things, he ended up doing those things a lot of the time under the competent spouse doctrine. But it doesn't work if he's good at everything, because then I don't do anything. And so I decided I was going to be the person who backed up the boat on the boat ramp. And if you've ever backed up a trailer, it's like it has a mind of its own. It defies physics. It goes all over the place. But it's not that hard to get good at it. But if you're doing a boat on a ramp, you have to get good at it under pressure, because not only are there other people waiting to use the boat ramp, but there are these people just standing around waiting for you to up. We call them rampies. And if you doubt their existence, just go to the internet and look up incidences of people screwing up on boat ramps, and you'll find people they drop the boat on the ramp, the boat goes in the water, the truck goes in the water. And the only reason these videos exist is because people are there watching. And so when I first started backing up the truck, I only did it when nobody was around. I practiced a little at home. But then, as you do, I got good at it. And okay, this is the embarrassing part. Because here's this totally ordinary skill, backing up a trailer. And I will tell you that not very much makes me feel as big and bad as getting into the cab of the F-250 in front of all these people who are assuming I'm going to fuck up, mostly because I'm a woman, and backing the boat down perfectly, quickly, skillfully, and then pulling that trailer into a tight parking space. And like, I don't care if the skill you don't have is hanging a picture. Lean in, hang a picture every day because it builds confidence and competence. And it was so fulfilling, and it was arguably more important than the food.
It's awesome. Since we are often in our day jobs, we're like journalistic rampies, we're like, that's totally wrong. but no, and I think another one of the lessons is it wasn't necessarily this in my marriage, right? Where it wasn't necessarily that you were going to be better than Kevin at doing the at driving the truck down the ramp, but it's like there was this sort of it was like Ricardo economics, right? Where it's like he's got enough things, and it's like even though he was better, that this was something where you could at least do it competently. It turned out you could do it well. Like I have this problem because Christina's better than me at everything. So I tend to just say, well, okay, well, I guess she'll do it. And she's a doer. And she's like, well, I'll do it because I'm not going to let you drive worse than me but anyway, I think there's a lesson that just because that you both got to participate and in the larger scale, this is what I keep saying about your book, and there's a larger lesson about life that you can't just leave it to everybody else because you're not going to be perfect at it. I think it's really amazing.
That's exactly right. And and it's funny because I have actually been complimented at the ramp where people say, wow, you're really good at that. And it's totally the soft bigotry of low expectations because Kevin is still better at it than I am, and no one's ever complimented him.
Well, it's amazing. I do think that since this is Climavores, and even though it's a book about more than food, it's still a book about food. I think we should talk a little bit about food.
That's our wheelhouse.
The first-hand activity that you talk about is gardening, and you started in the Upper West Side, and then you came to Cape Cod, and I love that the first thing you did, it's so journalist, is you kind of went to the USDA website and you tracked down basically what kind of soils you have in your backyard, and it's like 0 to 6 inches, crappy soil, 6 to 17 inches, crappy soil, 17 to 31 inches, crappy soil. I remember you said, and then it said, I mean, it didn't, but that's sort of what it felt like. I mean, gardening is something that probably a lot of listeners can relate to. Talk about the challenge of getting that going in a new environment.
It totally was. And, the USDA has this amazing database. It's the US Geological Service that does it. And there's a map of basically the whole country, and you can zoom in on your own backyard and find out what kind of soil is there. And in our case, it was crappy soil, aka Carver coarse sand. And I will say that gardening, of all the ways to get food, gardening is the thing I'm probably the worst at. And so in some ways, that means maybe I shouldn't be talking about it at all. But in some ways, I think maybe I should be the person talking about it because so many other people struggle with gardening. And even if you suck at it, which I do, you can still grow some amazing things. You just have to sort of learn to navigate whatever particular circumstance that you're in. And so, yeah, we have this crap soil. By the way, we also have a lot of shade. We have hilly terrain. We are just tailor-made for a bad gardening spot at our house. But eventually you figure out, okay, here's this one sunny spot. Here's where you can build a raised bed. Okay, we know that we can't grow root vegetables because we tried every single one, but we know that we can grow decent tomatoes and we can grow decent cucumbers and we can have a nice herb garden. And so gardening is basically an exercise in playing to your strengths. And even if you suck at it, you still get that miracle sense that something is growing out of the ground, and it never gets old.
I have tried a little gardening and I suck way worse than you. It's like, it's really embarrassing how bad I am. I mean, I just can't make anything happen.
So we should have a gardening podcast.
But yeah, exactly. We've talked a little bit on the show about how, there's a little bit of this kind of cult of agriculture where, and I don't want to, obviously all farmers are different, but there definitely is this. You mentioned the word supercilious earlier. There's this idea that like we're farmers, we provide your food, we feed the world, we are the heartland, we are the salt of the earth, and we deserve all these subsidies. And obviously, I find it kind of annoying. But then when I struggle to make actual food come out of the ground, you do realize that farmers are doing something kind of amazing. And granted, some like modern farming is a little different than gardening. It's maybe more like manufacturing, but that's pretty impressive too. They are absolutely doing stuff, and it has given me a little bit more appreciation, contrasting my absolute dysfunctional incompetence with the fact that people grow a lot of food every year and they make it happen.
You can't help but be sort of wowed by the sheer amount and also the skill that goes into this. And, I think farmers are kind of right to object to people who have, can't grow anything other than their toenails, talking about, how our ag system is broken. And I totally get that. And actually, one of the great things about growing your own food is that it does sort of, you internalize this idea that food has to come from somewhere and that it has impact when, you have weeds and you have to put pesticides to fight insects, and you have to amend your soil every year in order to grow anything like a decent garden. These are the same problems farmers have, just writ small. And, please don't mistake your backyard garden for a production farm. There's tons of differences, but there is that connection. And I think that is a really good reason to do it.
I think that's a great point, Tamar. Like, I'd love to hear you talk more about that, right? Because we talk about on this show, when we talk about the climate impact of farming, essentially we're talking about land, like the land you use. Could it be better? What's the cost of using it to grow stuff instead of having it be forests and trees or wetlands? And then the resources, like what is the impact of the pesticides, the fertilizers, the cows, everything that you're doing. That's essentially the climate impact that we talk about every week. And it's the same in your yard, right?
It totally is. It totally is. And so, we're making exactly the same kinds of decisions. I mean, we live on 2 acres that are almost all wooded. And so, yeah, I could make sunnier spaces, but it would mean cutting down trees. And we say all the time, deforestation is the thing that you don't want to do. And so I've become very attached to my trees, and we only cut them down if they're really threatening our house or getting in the way of things that we have to do that in a way that we don't have another answer to. But it's the reason we don't have the kind of solar array that you have on your house, is because we would have to cut down a bazillion trees to do that. And it seems like it's counterproductive. And so, yeah, when you are making decisions about what you can grow at your house, you're trying to minimize impact in all kinds of ways, in climate ways, but also in money ways. So I don't want to have to truck in yards and yards of soil in order to grow something because, first of all, there's the energy, there's the climate impact isn't even on my list, but there's the money, there's the logistics. And so you end up trying to do more with less, which is, of course, exactly what we're talking about our food system needing to be.
Right, and there's a perfect example where and obviously we we did a whole episode about planting trees is great. You planted a fig tree, right?
My poor fig tree.
But again, it's like you can have a fig tree which will store carbon and also make food
Until it dies back to its roots in a cold winter, which is what sucks.
Yeah, and until the insects eat all the food, right? But anyway, talk a little bit about the various climate impacts of some of the different kinds of gardening you did.
So here are the things that I think are big wins. I think that, first of all, where you led with is trees are a huge win because they're trees and they store carbon in and of themselves. And they can also, if they thrive, ask me how I know, give you a whole lot of fruit, but if they don't thrive, at least there's a little fruit there.
And I should say, we put in a star fruit tree here in Miami. And by we, of course, I mean the dude we paid to do it. But,
okay.
Like, we didn't actually do it ourselves. And you're right. When you eat the star fruit that grew in your own yard, it's like, that's awesome.
Right, of course. And so planting fruit trees and nut trees is probably maybe the single best thing you can do with the least climate impact, and actually maybe a positive climate impact, because if your tree grows, that's that much more carbon that isn't in the atmosphere. But there are other things as well. So one of the things that I think everybody should start with, both because it's pretty easy, it's small scale, and I think it has the real potential to reduce waste, is planting herbs. You know how they make you buy those big bunches when you only need a little bit? And they're often wet, which means they rot really quickly. And so even I'm anal about food waste. I really hate it. But even I sometimes end up with, this soggy parsley at the bottom of the crisper that I have to give to the chickens. And so planting your own herbs is terrific. And, planting lettuces is great because, let's face it, lettuce is a waste of agricultural resources. But if you grow it at home from seed, then you can enjoy the fresh lettuces without it having to be transported across the country.
Right. Close listeners will remember that Tamar has described lettuce in a certain scatological terms.
We won't go there again. But and the other thing that we love because we can do it and also because it uses basically a waste stream, is shiitake mushrooms. So if you have a recently dead tree, or if you can, get trees from landscapers who are taking them down for other reasons, and you can inoculate them with shiitake mushrooms, you can have shiitake flushes for several years with just basically one afternoon's backbreaking labor.
Well, from gardening, you then almost stumbled into livestock, right? You mentioned the chickens, and we actually did an episode where we talked about your chickens and pigs, when we did animal welfare. But talk about how you got into this, and what did you learn from livestock?
So, how when you go to the grocery store and you check out, and right at the checkout counter as you're waiting, there's Snickers bars and People magazine. And it's never like Green Beans and The Economist, because everybody knows what impulse purchases are. And so does the feed store. And so, Kevin and I were in there getting chicken feed one day, and they had these little cute turkey poults at the front of the store. And we're like, okay, look, they're 6 inches tall. How hard can it be? And so as impulse purchases go, I got to say livestock are not really where you ought to go. But it turned into this yet another exercise in, okay, we have to figure out how to house them, which was quite the ongoing drama. And we have to figure out, of course, how to slaughter them. And this was the first time that we had actually raised animals that we killed. And we were very committed to trying to do it right. And that's another skill. And this is the thing about skill acquisition. For me, this was really hard. I didn't want to kill an animal. A lifetime of watching, Wild Kingdom, I'm on Team Gazelle. But the harder it is to get yourself to do it, the more satisfying it is to have done it and to have done it well. And so raising livestock was a real important step in that way. And I knew where my Thanksgiving dinner had come from. And, it's probably not a climate win, because if you're raising animals, the way to do it in the most climate friendly way is to do it in the most efficient way. But I have issues with those efficiencies in terms of animal welfare. So this was a win for me for other reasons.
Right. And presumably, I mean, to get back into Dorkland, the main impact, the climate impact of raising livestock is going to be what they eat, right? And so if you're feeding them just scraps from your garbage, I mean, that would presumably be good. But if you're buying chicken feed from the store that's being, grown with fertilizers and pesticides.
And it's in the 50-pound bag rather than the railroad car, so it had to be packaged. And then you forget something and you have to go back to the store in your F-250, and it's like, it goes on and on and on.
Yeah, so those F-250s can cause a real problem, right? I think it makes sense that sort of raising livestock and growing food would have some climate issues. We talked in the last episode about how the invention of agriculture created all kinds of, early climate impacts, even by indigenous people. And you can understand that when they started burning forests and clearing forests, like we get it. But when we were just gatherers, you would think that would be perfect. And I'm sure it was. But as you said, like you thought foraging mushrooms would be like a perfect climate win, except there's an F-250 involved, right?
It's totally, yeah. This is the problem. So in general, foraging, as long as you don't take enough that it affects the ecosystem in any meaningful way, is a great climate-friendly way to feed yourself. However, anyone who's ever found a good mushroom will feel me on this, because as soon as you find out where the black trumpets are, or where the hen of the wood is, or where the morels come up, after every rain, you drive there to see if the mushrooms have come up yet. And so there was a tree in downtown, I use the term loosely, Hyannis on Cape Cod, where I live, that it was right off a parking lot, and we're driving by at like 40 miles an hour. And Kevin has bionic peripheral vision. I think it was developed from his
one of
years.
His magisteria.
This is totally his magisterium. That he was a commodity trader on the floor in New York. And to be a commodity trader, you stand in this big pit, and you've all seen probably Trading Places where they have the scenes like that. And Kevin was actually an extra in that movie. And you have to be aware of everything going on around you. And I think Kevin honed his peripheral vision that way. And we'll be driving down a road at 40 miles an hour arguing about politics, and he'll be like, "Did you see that?" Like, no, of course I didn't see that. I was arguing with you about politics. And then so we have to circle back, and there's this big mushroom there right at the base of this tree. And so then, of course, from then on, every time we're within 5 miles of the place, we have to drive by to see if the mushroom's back. And so, but in general, foraging is a climate win. And also you learn stuff. Mushrooms, I know people are reluctant to do mushrooms, and I get why, because like the upside is a tasty soup and the downside is an excruciating death. But it's really not hard to identify a few that you can eat. So I encourage everybody to try mushroom foraging.
Speaking of excruciating deaths, you also did some hunting. And so before we discuss your Bambicide, I do. One of my favorite stories in the book is you and Kevin in the deer blind. You got it. It's like it's so funny.
It cracks me up that this is your favorite story. So anybody who's ever hunted deer knows that mostly it sits around. It involves sitting around, being cold, not moving, waiting for deer to show up. And so here we were. We were over at there's a military reserve that opens it up for a hunt every fall, and we're sitting there in a deer blind. And you're trying not to move. And, I tried listening to like an audiobook in one ear, but then I knew I wouldn't like hear a deer unless it like gored me in the gut. And so we're sitting here doing nothing. And doing nothing is just not a thing that I'm good at. And I'm cycling through, I'm thinking about all kinds of things. Okay, what's for dinner? Am I going to have to clean the bathtub? Are we going to get the taxes in on time? I'm working on my all-purpose acceptance speech, Nobel, Oscar, whatever. And I have to say it's getting pretty good. And then, if we get a deer, how am I going to cook it? Venison breast. So I've got all these things going on in my head. And, Kevin's sitting there. I'm like, I wonder what he's thinking about. And so we're literally sitting there for 2 hours. And after we gave up on the deer, sun was setting, and we pack up our stuff. And Kevin goes, so were you thinking about sex that whole time too? And I'm like, the whole time? And he's like, well, I thought about that boat for a few minutes because we had looked at a boat. And
Kevin's the best.
It reminds me of the old New Yorker cartoon. I don't know if you remember this one. There was like 2 pie charts, one of men's brains and one of women's brains. And like men's brains, like the biggest piece of the pie was sex, and then there was a little piece for love, and then there was a good sized chunk for what's in the refrigerator. And women, there was this big piece for love and this little piece for sex, and then a big chunk for having to pee. That was classic.
There you go. So I think we did mention in our Thanksgiving episode that venison is, like, if you're going to go meat, that it's as climate friendly as you can get.
It absolutely is. And you're taking a wild, overpopulated ruminant that is in many places doing ecological damage out of the system. So as long as you don't drive your F-250 too far to get there, it's a total win.
So we haven't even talked about your oyster farming, which is an amazing environmental win. You also do a lot of fishing, which your diesel notwithstanding is a nice way of plucking food out of the ocean. But let's talk a little bit about the sort of big picture. It sounds like a little bit of a mixed bag, but is firsthand food a good thing for the climate?
So it's like you said, it's a mixed bag, and some is better for the climate, some isn't better for the climate. It depends on where you live, what the food is, how close the fish are to shore, how good your gardening skills are. But in a larger way, I think it connects you to food, and you start thinking about it differently. You think about it more mindfully. You think about it less wastefully.
There is an intellectual journey in this book that you've written. And like, we talk all the time about land, and when it's your land, I think you think about it differently. And when it's your food that you're pulling out of your land, it really makes you think about this idea. It's like, that was a lawn, and now, it's providing a tomato that no longer needs to be grown somewhere else that would also require land, and ultimately require deforestation. And I think it makes us think about the trade-offs we make when we use land. Oh, that was a lawn. It could ultimately be more nature. We could let it turn back and store more carbon, or we could use it to grow food, and that would help solve a problem. It's a way we talk about how the entire middle of the country, a lot of it used to be forests and wetlands that stored a lot of carbon, and now we've decided to use it in a different way to make our food, which is great, but it's making it so that we don't have to make it somewhere else. And there are all these trade-offs that I think that we kind of know intellectually, but that you feel it more in your bones when you're doing it yourself. Like we said at the beginning, this is the ultimate eating local, but it's not the same. We kind of made fun a little bit of eating local
Who's
in one
we?
of those early, well, especially me. But we both talked about some of the downsides that, people feel virtuous about it. They go to the farmer's market. They're in a community. Granted, it was just me who said it's like going to a NASCAR race where you're around your own people. But I think a lot of it is this feeling of being virtuous. While gardening, making your own food, it's the doing virtue. It actually is being virtuous and sort of contributing to this massive food supply where we're always talking about we're going to need X trillion calories. Well, you're providing some of that yourself, and that's that much less that needs to be provided through all these things that we talk about the downsides all the time.
Right. And by doing it yourself, something happens. And me, I'm a hard-ass empiricist. I'm all about trying to figure out the greenhouse gas emissions of all this stuff. But food is emotional, and gleaning food from the landscape around you with your own two hands, getting sturdy in service of dinner, recalibrates your most basic sense of what food is on a visceral level. And I think, we have grown up in an environment where we think of food as, the things in the boxes and the bags with the bright colors and the exciting punctuation. And that's what's in the supermarket. And you sort of internalize the idea that that's what food is. But when you spend time with it, I think the pendulum starts to move back toward a sense that food is the plants and animals that have been the foods that humans have thrived on since the beginning of humanity, basically. And I think that's something that we've lost in our modern era, and recapturing it is important. And it's important because I think it has the power to change the things you eat. But I think it also has the power to change the person you are. And I think we all want to eat better. We all want to be better. And by trying your hand at something food related that you haven't tried before, you kind of get to tackle both things at once. So it's about skill acquisition, and it's about dinner. It's about a more nutritious diet, and it's about a more competent human being. And, let's not forget that food is delicious, and there's joy in eating and feeding people that you love, and in tasting new things. And we lose that a lot in our wonky dork fest conversations about climate. And I think, getting dirty reconnects you to a lot of things, including that joy.
Well, one thing that really comes throughout this book, and I really hope everybody is clicking right now and buying To Boldly Grow.
Mike, you should go on QVC.
Even if you don't care, if you're listening to this podcast, you care about food and this stuff. But even if you don't, it's such a wonderful book about life and about love and about fun. One thing that comes through on every page is that this journey where you went from passive receptacle for food to somebody involved in creating your food is that you loved it. It was fun. And reading the book is fun. So I hope everybody will go and get To Boldly Grow. And never going to get a guest pimping their book as good as this one, Tamar.
Thanks, Mike. I do appreciate it. Climavores is a production of Postscript Media, and we want to hear from you. We want to know what you're thinking. We want to know what you're wondering about. Give us a call. We're at 508-377-3449, or drop us an email at climavores@postscriptaudio.com. And if you have any gardening disasters, we want them. The show is hosted by me, Tamar Haspel.
And me, Michael Grunwald.
Executive producers are Scott Clavenna and Stephen Lacey. Senior editor is Ann Bailey. Cecily Mesa-Martinez is the managing producer, and Dalvin Abuwaje is the associate producer. Engineering by Sean Marquand and Greg Vilfranc.
Postscript Media is supported by Prelude Ventures, a venture capital firm focused on climate solutions across energy, food, agriculture, transportation, logistics, and advanced materials. And we hope that after you buy Tamar's book and give it a 5-star rating on Amazon, you can then help us spread the word by giving us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or rate us on Spotify. We are also streaming on Amazon Music. And please, if you know somebody else who would like hearing us talk, after, of course, you tell them about Tamar's book, give them a link to Climavores.
And we'll be back next week shilling a book that isn't written by one of its co-hosts.